This is London.
.12 Greenwich Mean Time. BBC World Service, the news, read by Eileen McHugh. Turkey has announced the capture of the fugitive Kurdish rebel leader Abdulla Ocalan. The Prime Minister said he had been brought back to Turkey in an undercover operation. As he was speaking, Kurdish groups were staging protests in many European cities over the plight of the rebel leader. Other headlines: a series of explosions has rocked the capital of Uzbekistan, and the country's president says the attacks were an attempt on his life. Leading German companies have agreed to set up a fund to compensate victims of the Nazis. The capture of the Kurdish separatist leader Abdulla Ocalan. The Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit said the fugitive leader had been brought back to Turkey unhurt and would have to account for his actions before the courts. The announcement followed reports that Mr. Ocalan had been held by the authorities in Kenya after sheltering at the Greek embassy there. Lawyers for the rebel leader said he had been tricked by the Kenyan police. As Mr. Ocalan was being returned to Turkey, Kurdish groups occupied Greek embassies in at least 10 European cities. They accused Athens of handing over Mr. Ocalan, a charge strongly denied by Greece. Latest reports say protesters have begun withdrawing from some of the embassies. The Greek Foreign Minister, Theoforos Pangalos, has threatened to take action at home and abroad against Kurdish activists unless all hostages being held in Greek embassies around Europe are freed immediately. Mr. Pangalos again strongly denied that Greece had been complicit in Mr. Ocalan's capture and warned of a merciless response unless the Turkish Kurdish rebel group, the PKK, ordered its members to withdraw from the Greek areas they have occupied. A series of explosions has rocked Tashkent, the capital of the Central Asian Republic of Uzbekistan. The president, Islam Karimov, who was going to a government meeting nearby, said the attacks had been an attempt on his life. He was unharmed, but the government, calling the explosions an act of terrorists, said people had been killed, several cars had been destroyed, and buildings damaged. Mr. Karimov later went on television to urge calm. He said those responsible would be found and punished. There's no indication yet of who may be behind the attack, but correspondents say President Karimov's authoritarian government has long been concerned that it might be targeted by Islamic militants in the region. It's been announced in Germany that 12 leading companies are to set up a fund to compensate people forced to work for the Nazis during the Second World War. An estimated 1 million Jews, slaves and gypsies died as slave workers. The companies said they faced a moral responsibility over injustices of the Nazi era. The statement was supported by the German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, but no details were given about the size of the fund. The companies involved include BMW, Volkswagen, Bayer and Deutsche Bank. Pressure for a settlement had been growing following a recent agreement by Swiss banks to settle compensation claims. In Romania, several hundred miners have left the coal mining region of the Jiu Valley in the west of the country on board buses to protest in the capital Bucharest against a prison sentence imposed on their leader, Miron Cosma. Yesterday, the Supreme Court sentenced Mr. Cosma to 18 years in jail for his part in instigating riots in 1991 that overthrew the pro-reform government of Petre Roman. Mr. Cosma did not appear at the trial, and his whereabouts are unknown. After the sentence was announced, he appealed to his supporters to protect him from arrest. Last month, Mr. Cosma led an aborted miners' march on Bucharest during a dispute over wages and planned pit closures. The Cuban president, Fidel Castro, has presented 2 new laws to the National Assembly in Havana containing harsh penalties for criminals and political opponents of the Cuban government. One draft law proposes the death sentence for serious cases of drug trafficking and life imprisonment for violent robbery. The other stipulates jail sentences of up to 30 years for those found guilty of collaborating with the United States government, as well as for anyone convicted of disseminating subversive information. That's the end of the news.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. Coming next today, 5 minutes of news, and that's followed by Westway. And then in 20 minutes from now, Robert Powell reads part 3 of Captain Corelli's Mandolin in Off the Shelf. This is London.
Oh, 8 hours, Greenwich Mean Time. BBC World Service. The news read by John Stone. There's increased security throughout Turkey following the arrest of the Kurdish separatist leader Abdulla Ocalan. Kurdish demonstrators protested at Greek diplomatic missions throughout Europe, accusing Greece of involvement in the arrest. After a meeting in Belgrade with the chief American mediator, the Yugoslav president, Slobodan Milosevic, has reiterated his opposition to any deployment of international troops in Kosovo. The Truth Commission in South Africa has rejected a plea for amnesty from 4 policemen who were involved in the death in custody of the black consciousness leader Steve Biko more than 20 years ago. Security forces in Turkey are on alert following the capture yesterday of the Kurdish rebel leader Abdulla Ocalan. He's being held at an undisclosed location near Istanbul after being flown from Nairobi, where he had been hiding in the Greek embassy for nearly 2 weeks. Greece says Mr. Ocalan left the embassy after Kenyan officials offered to fly him to the Netherlands. But the Kenyan authorities say there was no deal. They deny any knowledge that Mr. Ocalan was being flown to Turkey. The PKK, the guerrilla movement Mr. Ocalan founded 20 years ago, has accused the United States and Israel of involvement in the abduction and warned that Turkey would pay dearly for it. Mr. Ocalan will be tried on terrorism charges and faces a possible death sentence. Kurdish demonstrators, accusing Athens of complicity in Mr. Ocalan's capture, have been occupying Greek embassies and consulates around the world. There were violent protests in more than 20 European cities, as well as in Canada and Australia. At some Greek diplomatic missions, hostages were taken. Demonstrators set themselves alight at protests in London, Stuttgart and Copenhagen. Turkish police clashed with Kurdish demonstrators in Istanbul. But many Turks celebrated Mr. Ocalan's return to face trial. Several newspapers printed banner headlines proclaiming victory. The Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic has reiterated his opposition to the deployment of international troops in Kosovo, as proposed in the current peace talks near Paris. In a statement, after a meeting with the chief United States mediator Christopher Hill in Belgrade, Mr. Milosevic said the refusal was not only the wish of the leadership, but also of all citizens of the country. Western diplomats quoted Mr. Hill, who has returned to Paris, as saying, "This is Judgment Day." If there is no agreement by midday on Saturday, NATO has again threatened airstrikes. A BBC correspondent in Belgrade says the Serb leadership may intend to accept the proposed peace plan, but rejects the idea of NATO policing it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa has rejected an amnesty for 4 former security policemen involved in the death in custody of the black consciousness leader Steve Biko in 1977. In a statement, the Commission's Amnesty Committee said it had refused amnesty after finding that the men had lied in their testimony about the events leading to Mr. Biko's death and had actually conspired to conceal the truth about them. The committee also found that the killing of Mr. Biko was not politically motivated, the requirement for granting amnesty. Steve Biko was one of the leading figures in the struggle against apartheid, and the decision means that the Biko family will be able to bring a civil action against the men. A court in France has sentenced a woman from Mali to 8 years in prison for the ritual genital mutilation of 48 young girls. The woman practiced what is known as excision over a period of 11 years in France on girls between 1 and 10 years of age. The removal of the clitoris is practiced in several countries in Africa, where it's considered a customary step towards womanhood and marriage. Opponents condemn the act as a gross violation of human rights, as well as being medically dangerous. The French case involves a national with Malian parents who laid charges against a woman known as Mama Greu, who performed the excision. More than 20 parents who had allowed their daughters to be mutilated by Mrs. Greu were given suspended prison sentences. And that's the end of the news.
2 days of unrest. As Jonathan Head reports from Ambon, the provincial governor has requested more assistance from Jakarta for the security forces, who are now struggling to contain the situation.
From across Ambon's beautiful harbour, columns of smoke could be seen rising this morning from 3 areas of the city. The bitter religious fighting, which destroyed much of this provincial capital last month, has erupted once again. The Muslim and Christian neighbourhoods, which have lived in peace side by side for centuries, have now barricaded themselves in, guarded by gangs of men armed with long swords and machetes. Outside Ambon's largest church, Christian youth file and saw metal poles into spears. In the city centre's oldest mosque, a Muslim community leader told me he could no longer guarantee that his own young men, guarding the 2,000 refugees staying there, would not use their weapons as well. Heavily armed soldiers and police are everywhere, trying to prevent further incidents. But they seem powerless to stop 2 communities apparently determined to fight each other. Bombs made from fertilizer are now being used by both sides.
Jonathan Head in Ambon. And turning to another Indonesian trouble spot, Australia says it's to open a consulate in the Indonesian territory of East Timor in a move to help settle the island's future. The decision was announced on the island of Bali, where the Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, has been meeting his Indonesian counterpart, Dr. Ali Alatas. Red Harrison reports from Sydney.
Mr. Downer says the date for opening the consulate will depend on negotiations over whether the people of East Timor accept a package of broad autonomy under Indonesian rule to be offered in April, or move immediately for full independence. Unlike the United Nations, Australia recognises Indonesia's jurisdiction over East Timor, though the government insists Australia has never approved the way the former Portuguese colony was incorporated. Now, though Mr. Downer says things went horribly wrong in East Timor because Jakarta failed to win the confidence of the people, Australia says it would prefer a period of autonomy before full independence. Privately, diplomats are concerned that too rapid a removal of Indonesian authority might set off a wave of violence and revenge killings as people try to settle old scores, or heavily armed factions on the island fight for supremacy. Mr. Downer says Australia hopes to coordinate aid for East Timor from the United States, Japan and Europe. Canberra will also send monitors to the national elections, which, if successful, he says, will transform Indonesia into one of the world's biggest democracies.
Red Harrison reporting from Sydney. The Chinese Prime Minister Zhu Rongji has left Beijing for Russia on a 4-day visit which is designed to boost trade between the 2 countries. It's his first official visit to Russia, but the latest in a series of meetings he's had with his Russian counterpart, Yevgeny Primakov. He's also expected to have talks with President Yeltsin and to sign a series of agreements. Diplomats said the trip would be another sign of an increasingly close political relationship between the 2 countries, symbolized by an informal summit between President Yeltsin and China's President Jiang Zemin late last year. Cooperation on international issues is part of this relationship, and the situation in Kosovo is likely to be discussed. From Beijing, Duncan Hewitt reports.
The warmth of the political relationship between Beijing and Moscow was symbolized by the prominence given in China's state media last week to a Chinese New Year's message from President Yeltsin, and Russia's foreign minister described relations with Beijing as the most dynamic aspect of Russian foreign policy last year. Yet both sides have expressed frustration at the low level of economic links. Plans to increase annual two-way trade to $20 billion were dealt a blow when trade actually fell last year to just $5 billion. Zhu Rongji and his delegation of senior trade and energy ministers will sign a series of agreements aimed at expanding economic cooperation. These include a further accord on plans to pipe gas from Siberia to eastern China. Russia has also sold nuclear power plants to China, and more such deals may be discussed, while Russian reports say sales of fighter planes are also a possibility, with military purchases an important aspect of improved political relations. But China also wants to develop civilian trade. Joint exploitation of forestry resources is on the agenda, as are plans to open department stores in Moscow selling Chinese consumer goods, which have proved popular in border regions.
Duncan Hewitt in Beijing. And later in this edition of Newsdesk, Britain awaits the publication of a report that's likely to be heavily critical of the police for their handling of a racial murder. And now a reminder of our main story. After the Kosovo peace talks, the Serb and ethnic Albanian delegations are returning home, taking with them appeals from the big powers for restraint. A court in the American state of Texas has convicted a white man of murder after he chained a black man to his pickup truck and dragged him to his death. A white supremacist, John William King, is one of 3 men being tried over the murder of James Byrd Jr. in the town of Jasper in June last year. Nick Bryant reports.
The jury took less than 2.5 hours to decide that John William King was guilty of capital murder, and there was applause in the courtroom as the verdict was read out. His victim, James Byrd, a black man from Texas, was murdered on June the 7th last year. Picked up by a group of white men while on his way home from a party, Mr. Byrd was beaten, chained by his feet to a pickup truck, and dragged for almost 3 miles along a remote country road. He was decapitated when his body was slammed against a concrete sewer. Prosecutors in the trial argued that 24-year-old King was a white supremacist, full of hatred towards blacks. He had staged the killing, they argued, to excite interest in a racist group which he was planning to set up. King could now face execution through lethal injection or life imprisonment. 2 other white men will also face trial later this year, charged with Mr. Byrd's abduction and killing.
That was Nick Bryant. The Clinton administration has blocked a multi-million-dollar satellite deal with China, saying it could jeopardize America's national security interests. The administration's refusal to grant export licenses to the satellite's manufacturer, the Hughes Corporation, comes amid mounting congressional criticism of such sales to Beijing. From Washington, our correspondent Richard Lister reports.
The $450 million satellite was designed to provide a mobile telephone network for much of Asia. It was ordered by a consortium based in Singapore, and President Clinton approved the sale 2.5 years ago. But it's since emerged that the buyers have close links with the Chinese military, and now the Hughes Corporation has been denied a license to export the satellite. A spokesman for Hughes said the deal would not have given Beijing any military advantage, but Defense Department officials were said to be concerned that technology used for tracking and maneuvering the satellite could also be used to improve missile guidance. The United States has long promoted commercial satellite deals with China in an effort to give American companies a foothold in a lucrative market. But a recent congressional report concluded that such deals could be harmful to American security, and there have been growing calls in Congress for more rigorous controls on technology exports. The State Department insists that the rejection of this deal doesn't reflect a change in American policy, but it does signal that such transactions are likely to face greater scrutiny in the future.
Richard Lister in Washington. The first satellite built by South Africa has been launched into orbit at the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The satellite, named SunSat, went up on a Delta rocket after 11 delays in recent weeks. Correspondents say a long period without contact caused anxious hours for the builders of SunSat, but communication was finally established. SunSat was created by engineering students at South Africa's Stellenbosch University. Its sensing instrument is a high-resolution stereo colour imager, useful for agricultural and environmental monitoring. The president of FIFA, football's world governing body, is meeting the head of the European Football Federation, UEFA, today in Geneva to discuss whether the World Cup could in future be staged every 2 years instead of every 4 years. The suggestion by the FIFA president Sepp Blatter is supported by regional football federations in Africa and East Asia, but has come in for strong criticism within Europe. Here's our sports correspondent Harry Peart.
The European Football Federation, UEFA, controls the strongest of the 6 confederations that make up world football. It has the strongest leagues and provides the bulk of the qualifiers for every World Cup. Sepp Blatter's suggestion that the World Cup is held every 2 years is facing strong criticism from within Europe, where there are fears of fixture congestion, exhaustion of top players performing for the top clubs, and the demotion of the continent's showpiece occasion, the European Championship, which is also staged every 4 years. The meeting in Geneva is an attempt to find some common ground and avoid a public conflict when the proposal comes under discussion by the FIFA Executive Committee next month. Sepp Blatter has much support from the African Confederation and from East Asia. Cutting the time between World Cups would give them more top international football, more money from FIFA revenues, and a better chance of staging the World Cup itself. Sepp Blatter proposes the 2-year cycle of the World Cup starts in 2009, avoiding a clash with the Olympic Games. But the new FIFA president, who beat Lennart Johansson in the election for the world's top job last year, will need all his powers of persuasion to sell the idea to Europe.
Harry Pearson. Staying with sport, the European football champions Real Madrid have sacked their manager. With more on that and a report into allegations of match fixing and bribery in Australian cricket, here's Martin Fuchs.
The European champions Real Madrid have sacked their Dutch coach Guus Hiddink after a run of poor performances which has left the team lying 6th in the Spanish league. Newspapers in Spain are predicting a return to the club for the Welshman John Toshak, who's been coaching in Turkey. Alex Simpson is a football journalist in Spain.
When they originally took on Toshak in 1989, they took on Toshak principally because his teams have always had a great disciplinary record, because they have a great attitude. They're great competitors, but very highly motivated, but very, very calm on the pitch. Real Madrid had a very sort of petulant side at the time, and that obviously served him well then. And I think they're thinking now that they need somebody who can take control of the dressing room, because that was the major problem with Hiddink.
In the English FA Cup, the so-called fair play replay between Arsenal and Sheffield United ended 2-1 to Arsenal, exactly the same score as in the first match, which ended on such a sour note. Mark Overmars, whose unsporting goal caused uproar in the first match, scored again in the second. A 2-month independent inquiry into Australian cricket between 1992 and 1998 has been released today. It concludes that there is no evidence of match-fixing or bribery in the Australian game. But the senior lawyer in charge of the investigation, Rob O'Regan, was critical of the Australian Cricket Board's lenient treatment of Shane Warne and Mark Waugh, following their admission of accepting money from an illegal Indian bookmaker.
I also disagree with the board about the penalties imposed in those cases. In my view, their conduct was serious, and it merited a punishment which is more proportionate to the magnitude of the offence. And I think they should have been suspended for a significant period of time.
Finally, the second match of the Asian Test Championship is underway under heavy security in Colombo. India were put into bat by Sri Lanka and are going well at 246 for 1. Sadagopan Ramesh is 141 not out, and Rahul Dravid is on 87.
Martin Fuchs with the sport. The widely leaked report on the unprovoked racist murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence in London 6 years ago is due to be published today.
It's called an erroneous decision. The American company involved in constructing the satellite, Hughes Electronics, said it hoped to overturn the decision. Washington said it was vetoing the project, worth more than $400 million, because of security concerns over the transference of technology to companies that had links with the Chinese armed forces. The American Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, is due to visit China next week. Israel's Supreme Court has ruled that a Jewish American teenager accused of murder in the United States can't be extradited because he has the right to Israeli citizenship. 18-year-old Samuel Scheinbein fled to Israel in 1997 after the mutilated and burned body of an acquaintance was discovered in the garage of an empty home in Maryland. To prevent extradition back to the US, where he was charged with the murder, Mr. Scheinbein claimed Israeli citizenship through his father. And that's the end of the news.